Hello, my name's Craig, and it has been a really long time since I've done a YouTube video. I was going to say I'm sorry about that, but I'm not. You've got plenty of other stuff to watch on YouTube. Anyway, the only reason I'm doing this as a preface to the 40-minute video that you're about to watch is that some things have changed since I recorded the video a couple of days ago. The video is basically 40 minutes of me making my Twitter images and talking you through the things that I'm thinking as I'm doing them. So the video has got, it's got quite a lot of use in it, but one thing changed. Recently, the other day, I rebranded Produce More to be called Unobvious. So when I'm talking about Produce More, it isn't called Produce More anymore, it's Unobvious, number one. And then number two is the thing that I think you're going to really enjoy is the fact that the video is 40 minutes long, and probably about 20 minutes, I start to get quite bitter about the whole experience of narrating my 40-minute video that originally was an hour long. So the bitterness is quite enjoyable, and I've left a lot of it in. Here I am, wasting time, and now you're wasting time by watching me waste time, and I'm wasting time talking over me wasting time. We're all wasting time here. All of us. Overall, the video is actually really powerful. It shows you the insides of what I'm thinking, how I design stuff, and basically my thought processes behind visualizing a quotation on Twitter. So enjoy. Hello, I'm back. This is my YouTube. Speaking a bit. Wow, that was a bit jazz handsy there at the end, wasn't it? Earlier tonight, I wrote this tweet, and the idea was that I wanted to get my Produce More Twitter account to 1,500 followers. So the idea behind it was that I was going to sit down and visualize anybody's idea that came through for the entire hour. And because I'm a raging show-off, I decided to record it. So this is an entire screen recording of just over an hour of me making those images. This entire hour is going to be an add-on to my already free course of how to visualize a tweet, which I've got on Gumroad, which you can find on my Produce More Twitter account. It's going to be an extra video in there that's probably going to be about 40 minutes long, maybe 50 minutes long. I've sped me actually designing up by 1.5%. So if I look faster than I'm normally working, I am actually working faster than I am. I'm not that good. I mean, I'm good, but I'm not that good. So here we go, me getting ready to start this. To try and get some inspiration before any tweets come flooding in, I look on a website called quotewise.com. It's a website I use a lot to find inspiration for the Produce More tweets that I do every single day, where I visualize other people's quotes. Some of them are a bit rubbish, to be honest. All right, some of them are very rubbish on there, but I use this website quite a lot because it's got a huge range of quotes. And if you sit there for a while, like I do, if you sit there and look at them, some of them are actually quite good. So here we go. We've got our first tweet in already. The artist sees what others only catch a glimpse of. It felt like for this one that I needed to show two different frames. So I started by making two different frames. And the setup that I'm doing here, by the way, is what I do for every single Produce More image. I write a title for each one. You never see this title. I used to include it in the Instagram and the Twitter, but I don't include it anywhere anymore. So that's just my private little thing that I do to try and get an idea of what I'm going to make for each image. So I had the idea for this one that it was going to begin with a circle of some kind. I had the simple idea that I was going to just make a stroke of a circle on both of them, and the first one would just be a tiny little sliver of that circle. So this is me here testing that idea out. And if you ever watch any of the other kind of fast-forwarded versions of my Produce More images, you'll see that I'm often trying ideas out like this. I have an idea in my head immediately. The reason I pick a quote in the first place is because I already have the idea in my head. I don't start working on anything until I have an idea in my head. So when I saw this and when I made it, I quickly realized that it looked a little bit boring. So I started making lots and lots of circles. The idea behind this was I was going to make a tunnel a depth tunnel that looked like it was getting deeper and deeper and deeper. Maybe like you were looking down the bottom of a well or something like that. So this is me trying this idea out here. You can see me painstakingly making each individual circle, which is a bloody nightmare to do in Figma accurately. So I quickly realised a different way of doing it. I started duplicating each circle, and there's a little known trick in Figma where instead of using the sizes in the top corner, you can put percentages. So what I did was take the first circle, duplicate it 90%, second circle, duplicate it 90%, and repeat over and over and over and over. And what that does is it makes this kind of really nice depth effect that's going on here. As you can see, the circles are getting closer and closer together as we're getting deeper into the hole, which looks really pleasing to the eye. And all I'm doing is just changing each one to 90%. The other thing you'll notice here too is that I'm using a shortcut to center things in the page. On Mac, that is Alt and V to center vertically, and Alt and H to center horizontally. I use these two shortcuts endlessly in Figma. It's one of the key things I use constantly. So here we go, I'm finishing off this work, and I'm nearly done with these final circles. I mean, I'm struggling to fill here. I'm struggling for things to say because all I'm doing is making circles. Here we go, so I'm finally finished. So the idea I had was for the first one, just to show kind of a sliver of the final thing. What I often do when I'm making these two contrast things on Instagram or Twitter, I start by making the end one and then bring the end one to the first one. It's much easier to make a contrast that way than it is making the first one and then trying to match the contrast up to the last one. So the way that I do it is backwards. You make the final version and then duplicate it to the first version. It means that they identically match when it comes to making them. So here you can see I'm trying to just get the sliver right. I had the idea that it was going to be dots at first, a series of dots, but then when I started messing with it, it just didn't look right for some reason. I get this feeling a lot when I'm making these images that something might not just look quite right. And I can't articulate it any further than that. It's just that it doesn't look quite right. And this final bit of the work here is I'm just making the Twitter images. So every single image that I make on Twitter and on Instagram, I do the Instagram images first because they're slightly taller than the Twitter ones. And then I decide how the idea is going to be applied to Twitter afterwards. There's a note to make here that when I make stuff on Twitter and Instagram, they don't always look identical to each other. Sometimes the idea is a little bit different when I make one on the other, but in this instance, it's ended up looking pretty much the same. There's no real difference between these two that I'm making. And then this is just some final boring bits that I'll skip because you don't want to see it. Hello, so we're back again with another quote. So now I've had a tweet from Charles, thank you Charles, and he gave me 3 quote ideas for this next one. I decided to pick the middle one. And the reason I decided to pick the middle one is because the obstacle is the way was the simplest visual that I could think of. Every time I'm looking for a tweet, and I talk about this in the rest of the Gumroad course, every time I'm looking to visualize a tweet, I'm looking for a tweet or a phrase that is already visualized. You're not looking to visualize something that isn't already visual because that's bloody hard. Almost next to impossible to be able to do that. So what I'm really looking for when I'm doing this is I'm looking for tweets, I'm looking for text, I'm looking for the things that already feel visual, and the obstacle is the way, the phrase, and the name of the book by Ryan Holiday is obviously already visual. So I've already got an idea for this. I had an idea in my head, and again these pop up straight away, of a mountain. And initially when I started doing this, I was thinking that I was going to do a mountain and then an arrow over the top of the mountain somehow. But then when I started making the mountain and trying to simplify the idea as much as possible, which is another thing that I often do, I try and simplify the idea right down to the core idea, the simplest thing I can think of. In this case, it was a triangle with a bottom missing off. And then as soon as I did that, I realized, maybe I could just add an arrow on to the end of this. And it looks exactly like what I expect. So that's what I did. I just added an arrow. And then the final thing I started trying to do with this one, I was trying to make it look like it was a mountain. I was trying to make it look a little bit more obvious to be a mountain, so I was trying to put a gradient on it. But I just couldn't get the gradient to look right, and there's a lesson to learn here. If you're trying to make visuals and something doesn't work right and you're spending 10, 15 minutes on it, I mean, here I spend about 5 minutes on it and it's too long. When you spend 5 or 10 minutes and something just isn't working, remove it. Just get rid of it. Because the piece that you'd made before that was probably good enough anyway. And that was the instance here. It was already good enough, already looked like a mountain. Job done, move on to the next one. Although, just as I said that, you can see me fiddling with this here. You can see me not taking my own advice. I'll do this on most pieces that I make. I'll fiddle with them for a couple of minutes afterwards unless I already know the idea is perfect. I had an idea that I could maybe make the lines shorter because when I was looking at this, I wasn't quite happy with the composition. I wanted the lines to be shorter and the idea of the mountains to be clearer, but then when it came to the piece, I just couldn't get it to look right, so I left it as it was, and then I finished off the piece, the Twitter image and the Instagram image, and then uploaded it to Twitter again, and another boring bit, and we'll skip to the next image. Okay, so we're back again with another quote, and by now I've already had quite a few people come in and give me ideas, and then I tried to pick them in order because I'm a nice guy. I've been trying to pick the next one down the list. It's impossible to do that with Twitter other than looking at the times because they've started messing with this and it really bugs me. So I was looking down the times to find the next one, and the next one that comes up is, I think it's Ardit. I'm really sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, but the next one is quality input leads to quality output. But the first thing I do is I go over to Google, and I do this with every quote, to try and find out who the first person was to say this. I've obviously heard this phrase before, quality input, quality output, but I couldn't remember who it was. And I think it's one of those phrases that's got no originator because it's been around for so long. I mean, this phrase has been around for a really long time. I don't know, maybe not millions of years, but thousands of years, definitely thousands of years. So I couldn't find the person who said the quote, but I was still going to do it anyway. I actually quite struggled with this idea, but it was the next one down the list, so that's what makes this challenge so interesting, that sometimes when I come to do these, it's actually quite difficult to do because, as I said, I always pick the quotes that are already visual. This one isn't really that visual. I mean, how do you visualize quality? How do you visualize input? How do you visualize output? The thing that was coming to my mind was some kind of conveyor belt, and I'm back on Twitter here, hoping that he tells me who wrote this. I was thinking some kind of conveyor belt, and I really struggled with the idea because, as I said, it wasn't really that visual. So I started with the idea of a conveyor belt, of some kind of conveyor belt. No, I didn't. I started with a flowchart. So yeah, this is what I often do with these kind of ideas when I struggle. I start with a flowchart to map the idea. If I have literally got 0 ideas for an image, I'll either sack it off, or in this instance where I can't sack it off and I've got to make some kind of image that looks good enough, I'll use a flowchart. Flowcharts are my cop-out ideas. So I start by making a flowchart, and then I quickly realize that, when I've made this image, a flowchart is probably the most boring way I could attack this idea. So I'm just messing around with the flowchart here, and then when I make the first part of the flowchart, I realize, maybe this is a box, and maybe I can put a box on a conveyor belt. Conveyor belts and all, in fact, no, let me back up. The reason I'm using a conveyor belt and the reason I'm using a box is because this is one of those ideas that's kind of universally understood. The simplistic drawing of a conveyor belt is something that everybody, almost globally, would recognize as a thing that takes something from one end and dumps it off the end of the other side. So when I'm making these images, I'm always looking for the simplest solution possible and also the most universally recognized solution possible. And obviously one of those is some kind of conveyor belt. So I start with a conveyor belt. I put a thing in the middle that shows the input passing through something. I didn't feel like this idea was immediately obvious. And I was already struggling with this idea at this point as well. So I decided to make it obvious which direction the things were traveling in on the conveyor belt. Looking back on this now, putting arrows on there is maybe a bit of a cheap idea, but it does help people understand a piece if you want to direct them from left to right. Most people, especially in Western society, already understand things travel from left to right because they read from left to right. So you can reasonably assume that someone is going to figure that out. But I wasn't convinced that people would figure that out with this one. So here is me probably trying to overcomplicate this idea a little bit. You can tell I'm struggling with this one because it took me one of the longest amount of times of all the ideas because I couldn't get a visual. I just couldn't get something that I thought was good inside my head. And you might be looking at this and thinking, well, Craig, this is already okay. This is good. This is fine. But I wasn't sure about it. And even at this point, I wasn't sure about it. I'm looking back on Twitter here to see if he's replied to me, to see if he knows who the quote was from, but he didn't. So I come back to this and you can see this is where things I'm starting to think about this a bit more and I want to simplify. So I look at the idea and I realize it's gotten a little bit too complicated. So I decide to try and simplify it in some fashion. Here you can see me trying to simplify it to its very, very core element, which is the idea of a thing starting on the left and passing through to the right. And the version you see now is pretty much the final version of what I go for. I show a divider and an identical thing on the left, an identical thing on the right. I'm still not 100% sure on this idea, to be honest. It's okay, but I ended up getting rid of the conveyor belt, so people aren't necessarily going to universally understand this idea as they might have done in the first version of it. So yeah, I'm not sold on this idea, but it was the idea that ended up getting published, and there we go, I'm publishing it. Let's move on to the next idea. Oh, I always really love Joey's ideas. So this next one was an idea from Improvement Geek. Joey, I love his tweets, and I'm thankful to kind of know him on Twitter. In fact, we're doing a podcast soon on Get Doing Things podcast. And probably by the time you watch this will already have been released. So look out for that podcast. Anyway, I'm filling time here. So the tweet is, unhappiness leads to bad decisions. Bad decisions lead to unhappiness. Break the cycle. There's plenty of stuff inside this tweet to visualize. There's the idea of unhappiness and bad decisions. And then the idea of flipping those on the head. Obviously, I'm going to go to my thing that I use on Produce More a lot here, which is the Smiley Face. I love using Smiley Faces on Produce More. If you've seen the account, you'll know I'm a big fan of them. So the first thing I go to is a Smiley Face. And again, following the pattern that I do with these things, I usually try and do the last portion of the image, so the transformation of the image first, and then turn into the last one. But for this one, I wasn't quite sure where I was going to take this because I've used Smiley Faces so many times on Produce More that it's hard to be original with them anymore. So I started by just messing with the idea of eyes and an unhappy face, a downward smile. I don't know, what do you call that? Frown? Yeah, maybe you just call it an unhappy face. So I start to get the idea of an unhappy face here, but I want to show some kind of transformation from unhappiness to happiness. So I use the timeless idea of arrows, and I get this idea of arrows. I think, right, well, I'm going to use a nose as an arrow. This is another thing I do on Produce More quite a lot. I use certain symbols that mean something else in a different context, and when you do it like this on a face, when you anthropomorphalize that word, something like that. When you use that word, anyway, when you turn something that's static into a face, you can use all different kinds of symbols for all different kinds of stuff. And here I was trying to link the circles, which are the eyes, to the downward arrow. It didn't work, so I just left the downward arrow. And then the transformation for this one is pretty straightforward, to be honest. It's expected. We turn the frown upside down. And the way that we turn the frown upside down is to put the arrow on the end of the smile. As soon as I started getting this, the idea from frown to frown upside down, I kind of had the idea straight away in my head. It's pretty obvious. And what I do here is I use the same elements from the left into the one on the right, because it shows consistency of the idea, and it shows the idea developing across it shows the idea developing across a composition, which helps guide the user through. Why am I calling users? Jesus Christ, I'm pretending I'm making web designs here. It guides the viewer through the piece. So it's a tactic you can use a lot when you're doing some kind of comparison images. When you're using one image and a second image, use the same elements in the first one to the second one, because it shows a comparison or a development of the idea from the first to the second. Anyway, that's kind of art history, or really bad Craig art history 101 over. This image is done. Let's move on to the next. Oh, I really liked this next one. This was Julia's personal mantra, and she asked me to visualize it for her. I like these really personal ones because they're not just an abstract quote, and people really, really value them when you visualize somebody's personal mantra, because it's something they hold dear to themselves in the heart. So this one was scale your impact. When I thought about this one, obviously I was going to show something small, go into big, and I was going to use two different panels like I usually do for these transformation things, but I thought, no, let's try something different. Let's show the scale. Let's show the thing going from small to big in one panel. That was my constraint for this piece. I do that a lot when I'm making these images. I kind of set myself little mini challenges inside the challenge to do something in a certain way. So my challenge for this one was to use one frame to show a transformation between one thing into a bigger thing. I was always going to do for this one, I was always going to do a small thing to a bigger thing. And the idea that immediately came to me was squares. I'd already done squares in quite a few of the other ones during this session. So I wanted to show the square getting bigger. An idea that I've had in my head for a while, and I was recycling this idea. An idea that I've had is to do some kind of projection of a thing getting bigger. So I was going to start with a small square and a bigger square and show the square projecting into something bigger. That thing isn't easy to do in a very simplistic vector program. So I started with the final two elements, really, the big square and the little square, and this is me trying to figure out how that's going to look. I kind of, in my head, I had the idea of an IKEA drawing, that kind of thing, as an instruction manual almost. And trivia, Produce More started out in the idea, I actually called it the instruction manual for getting more things done. And the idea of Produce More was going to be instruction manual type images for productivity. Side note over. So here we go. I'm trying to make the instruction manual type image that I had in my head, and that's why I used the dash lines. But I found that with the dash lines in this case, they were taking over it a little bit too much. So I started trying to show depth in some different ways by putting the image directly in front of it, like this, which clearly shows some depth to the piece, some perspective. But now when I did this, it was crowding out the bigger version. So I started trying to make the dashes just a little bit less obvious by reducing the opacity on them. But you can see me here starting to get the idea. So I was going to put a dash to each corner of the bigger one to show a projection, but it wasn't quite looking right still at this point. But you'll see me in a minute start to try and move the other square away from it until it starts to look right. I'm not going to lie here. I'm going to really struggle to make this interesting for you. So I don't even think I've got anything else to say, but it is quite important that you watch what I do next with these two pieces. But I haven't got enough fluff that I can say to make this piece look right. Because you'll see now that I move the square down and then I take the two lines and drag them down. This piece here, the bit where I drag the lines down, complete fluke by the way. I didn't expect Figma to react like that. I thought I was going to have to redraw the shape. And now you can see here, when I move the square down, now the perspective is there. Now the scale is there. You can see the thing going from small to big. The reason for this is that I've moved it away so considerably that there's a clear transformation and a clear extension of the small piece into the big piece. Immediately looks way more obvious. And then the final thing, and this is where I'm doing the same thing as I did last time, I start to try and over tweak the piece. I start to try and use gradients to make them look nice. You'll see that I quickly realize that gradients aren't going to add anything to this piece. And then I look at it and go, yeah, it's actually okay. But I'll just try and use gradients in the other direction just a little bit more to see if they work. This is me being completely open here. This is me over tinkering with a piece that pretty much already looks okay. So take a lesson from me here. Don't over tinker with something that already looks fine, because you'll just waste time. Here I am wasting time, and now you're wasting time by watching me waste time, and I'm wasting time talking over me wasting time. We're all wasting time here. All of us. And I guess I could skip this. Yeah, let's skip this. I finally stopped tinkering. I've skipped the bit and we see the finished piece. And then I'm just going back to the Twitter piece here and just getting rid of the gradients. Piece done. Let's move on to the next one. No, I really had fun with this next one. This next one is Ben's quote, and it is attack the fucking day. He says this every day on Twitter. He obviously dropped it into my Twitter thread, and I had to do it some kind of justice. I'd already previously done this, and I didn't do very much justice to it last time, so I thought I had to redeem myself on this one. And to redeem myself, I was just going to use a simple idea, which was writing the letters D-A-Y, day, obviously, and I was going to turn them into dead letters. I had the original idea that I was going to do chalk outlines of them. This is a downside to Figma here, by the way. In Figma, you can't skew letters. So I had to go over to the trusty old bloated piece of Adobe software, which is Adobe Illustrator, just to be able to make letters that are skewed. So I'm jumping into Illustrator here, and all I'm doing, I am literally only using Illustrator to skew the letters. Please, Figma, add this feature so I can finally get rid of Illustrator. It's ridiculous. I have to subscribe to an entire creative suite to be able to use pretty much this one feature. Anyway, rant over. You can see me here skewing these letters. I'm trying to skew them so they look like they're laid down, but at the same time, I'm also trying to make them still readable, which is actually really difficult to do, because when something's laid down and you're looking at them dead on, you tend to not be able to read the thing very well because it's laid on the floor and you're looking directly at it. So I had to cheat the perspective here a little bit, and you'll see me tinkering with the perspective of this for quite a bit just to make it right. And obviously we've got to make this right, but I'm not trying to make it right. I'm trying to make it right enough so you can still read it, but wrong enough so you can still read it, and good enough so it looks like it should be laid down. Tough balance to make. These are the things I do every day as a designer to try and make your life a little bit easier. Aren't you really lucky? I've skipped on a bit here because I finally got the letters back into Figma, and this is where I start to try and do my magic to them. So I'm trying to make them look dead. Obviously at the minute they are just laid down. They don't look dead, they look sleepy, and I need to try and arrange them in a little bit of a fun composition as well. I don't just want them all in a line, even though if we were looking at them in a perspective wise, they would just be in a line. So another thing here that I'm always trying to do when you're making something, you also have to make it look visually interesting or visually pleasing in some way. And usually perfect alignment isn't that visually pleasing to somebody. Or, no, let me rephrase that. It is visually pleasing, but it isn't visually interesting. They're two different things. And ideally, you need to achieve visual interest and visual pleaseness. Yeah, that's a word. Pleaseness. So to achieve both of those things, you have to break one of them. In this instance, I decided to break the visual pleaseness to make it visually interesting. I'm going to keep using pleaseness. I like that word, visual pleaseness. So to make them look dead, I went for the simple age-old idea of blood. I'm manually drawing the blood splatters in Figma here, which isn't an easy feat. I'm using the pen tool here. If you've not got really much experience of using the pen tool, go check out my other free Gumroad course, which is How to Design Like Crap, Figma Fundamentals. It'll go through some elements of visual pleaseness, and also it covers how to use the pen tool in quite a lot of depth. It's an advanced feature that a designer will spend their entire career almost exclusively hating, and then they get to a certain point in their career where they exclusively start loving the pen tool. It does take a lot of practice. I think it is one of the most difficult skills as a designer to learn, because you need to use it for a really long time, and it is actually really the only skill, as in like a hard skill, like learning how to hit a ball or something like that. It's one of the only hard skills you've got to learn in design to become a good designer. But you can get away with being bad at the pen tool. You'll just find it difficult to get ahead. So here you can see me using the pen tool to make all the different blood spatters and everything like that. Nothing really special here. And now you'll see me just filling with the blood spatters to try and make it look right. With this here, I made the blood a little bit darker red because I didn't want it to look comic. I wanted it to look quite serious, but I also wanted you to be able to just about read the letters. I did consider not using red in this because I never use a different colour in Produce More. This trivia point again, this is the second ever time in a Produce More image since May, I think it is, i.e. when I started. It's only the second time ever that I have used another colour other than black and white in my images. Fun fact. This one's nearly finished here, and this gets uploaded in a second. Again, you can see me tinkering, and it's done. Yeah, it's done. I'm just copying it into the Twitter thing, and it's done. Let's move on to the next image. I really like this next quote. The next quote is, "The future favours the bold." I had an inkling at first when I heard this, "the future favours the bold." I'd heard the phrase before, but actually when I went away and Googled it, I realised that I'd not heard "the future favours the bold" before. It's "fortune favours the bold." So the phrase is actually a little bit different. And for this one, as soon as I saw "future favours the bold," I went for one of the troll type images that I do every now and again on Produce More. Future favours the bold, make it bold, job done. I mean, there's not really much else going on with this idea. I just do these images every now and again where I take an almost literal understanding, and this is literally a literal understanding of bold, and use it in an image, and the job is done and it gets uploaded to Twitter. Really not much anything else to say about that one. And you'll be happy to know we are on the final idea of this session. Joshua Lysek's quote, "The best books give readers what they want, and that which the author also wanted to write." I liked the idea behind this, that it was a connection between the reader and the writer and the writer and the reader. And I wanted to get that across in this image. And also, I had the idea pretty much straight away. This is obviously about book writing. Joshua Lysek is a ghostwriter. He writes books. I wanted to get the simple, like a super, super, super simple idea, visual representation of a book across, as well as showing a connection between a writer and a reader and a reader and a writer. So I had an idea in my head just as I was typing this out. that I was going to show a book laid down on a table as simply as possible. So I was going to use basically two upside down smiley faces. I don't know why I suddenly forgot what smiley faces were called there. I mean frowns. Well, I don't mean frowns. I mean an unhappy face. Yes, Craig, that's what you mean. So I was going to use two curves, downward curves. You can tell we're nearly at the end of this video now. I'm really sorry, but you know, this is the best I can muster when we're at the end of a 40-minute video. I'm using downward curves to show the bottom of a book. And I thought, well, is that idea enough to show a book? And I was going to leave the idea there. But as you can see when you're looking at this, it looks nothing like a book. I mean, at all. Looks nothing like a book. It's just two people and an arrow. You maybe not even understand the idea that two people are here, but you would when you saw the quote. So I knew I needed to add something else to this. So I duplicate it and use the 90% trick as well, because I had the idea that I was going to show multiple people getting smaller and smaller and smaller in a perspective going backwards, which would also show the pages, the words on the page, and would eventually build up an entire book, an open book. But then I thought, maybe I can just simplify the idea by just moving the top one. So I'm duplicating this one again because I was just fiddling with the layout a little bit. Then I duplicate it again and make it just a little bit smaller and show the top of the book and the bottom of the book and leave it there. Sometimes when I make images like this, I'm not sure whether visually people are going to understand them. But sometimes I think you've got to take these risks, because when you make an image that isn't immediately obvious to somebody, they make the connection in their own head. And that is a million times more powerful than forcing an idea down somebody's throat. This is the same as telling a joke. The reason that a joke works is because the person makes the connection in their own head rather than you forcing it down their throat. If you have to explain a joke to somebody, it isn't really that funny anymore. So the thing I'm always trying to do with the produce more images is try to find balance between making something obvious and making it just cryptic enough that somebody has to work it out. It's a really difficult balance to make. And you can see me here almost frantically trying to make this a bit more obvious. And then I eventually get to this point where I think, yeah, it looks like an open book enough that I'll take a risk on it. And that's the finished piece. That's the finished piece. I upload it to Twitter and we are done. This ended up being about 35 minutes of my ideas that I did in an hour on Twitter. I hope it was helpful. If you've got any questions at all, please just hit me up on Twitter, twitter.com/Craig Burgess. And I'll, speak to you soon, I guess. I hope you enjoyed it.